And what better subject to talk about over your lunch than people being killed? Because we're joined in the studio by a colleague of mine from another place, writer and broadcaster, James Buttler, who has written a new book entitled Killer Instinct. I've been tying him for months. He should have called it Sport's Greatest Killers, but he didn't listen to me. James, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Why or what was the inspiration behind writing a book about people killing other people?
Well, just to go back a step, you are in the intro. There is a reference to your tongue-in-cheek comments about calling it something else, but it's not a book I wanted to make out was glorifying the act of murder, because it's a bad thing, kids. Don't murder anybody today. Save it till tomorrow, no. But yeah, the inspiration came from the Oscar Pistorius stuff. I'd spent a bit of time in South Africa covering the cricket. Yorkshire were out there in the Champions League at the end of 2012. And came back and got a little bit of an affinity. When you visit somewhere and you stay a while, you get a bit of an affinity with the place. Yeah. And so when the Pistorius thing came up, I was quite interested. And I've always liked sport. That's why I became a sports journalist. But I also like crime and crime thrillers and all that kind of stuff. So got quite hooked on the Pistorius stuff. And his case was different in that it was did he or didn't he kind of stuff. There wasn't any actual real proof. It was his word, and whether you believed him or not. So it's quite an interesting case in itself. And then one afternoon, I was a little bit at a loose end, and I Googled myself.
Which is something you should never do.
As you do. And James Buttler came up as... my name's got 2 T's in it. James Buttler, the super middleweight boxer from America, has 1 T in his name, but he came up first, which... dented my ego a tad, but he'd been found guilty of murdering one of his friends, a guy called Sam Kellerman, who was a boxing journalist, and started to think, well, there's Pistorius, there's my namesake. Off the back of the Pistorius stuff, a lot of people did, and he's not the only person that's been a naughty boy. There's others as well. So kind of catalogued a few together and realised that there's potentially a book in this, and ultimately there is. It's sat on the table in front of me. 29 killers in there. And they've all come from all sorts of different walks of life, different sports, from all sorts of different places around the world. But the one thing they have, 2 things they have in common. They were very good at sport and professional sports people, and they've also taken at least 1 life. There's, in fact, one of them has taken 7 in there. He's classed as a serial killer. But I think the interesting thing about it all was that it... obviously, being interested in sport, it was nice for me to be able to look at some other different sports. I mean, there's anything in there from skateboarding and sumo wrestling to American sports and all kinds of things. But to see the kind of pressures that sports people, the psychology of it all, sports people have to cope with quite a lot on the pitch, and only the very best can tackle the really, standing on the 18th fairway, having to get down in 2 to win the Open or something. There's certain pressures on that, but in a wider world, we all have different pressures on us, and some people are able to cope with them more than others. And the guys in this book, for various reasons, didn't cope very well.
When you're researching these people and obviously writing their stories up, do you feel a bit of sympathy for them? Do you feel hatred for them? How do you feel when you're looking into these various different people?
When I started doing the project, I assumed that I would actually think that they were all nasty, mean creatures that deserved to rot in prison. But I think there are certainly, of the 29 in there, there's a lot that are in that category that are just nasty pieces of work. But I think there's also a number in there who, if you get past the fact that they committed a horrendous crime, which cannot be excused in any shape or form, you can sympathise a little bit with some of their stories, because, I've spoken to you before about American sportsmen who've had, they call it CTE, which is a term for kind of head trauma, and it can only actually be diagnosed at post-mortem. You can't actually officially diagnose it when somebody's alive. But basically, having sustained head trauma, if you're an American footballer like Jovan Belcher that's in the book, the wrestler that's in there, Chris Benoit, they basically, because they had their heads beaten around so often, it changed their characters and changed their personalities, made them prone to mood swings, violent tempers, aggression, when beforehand they were quite mild-mannered creatures that were just good at sport. And I think you can read some of those stories and think, well, that was external influences that got them into that situation. What they did was horrible, but you can sympathise a little bit from that. There's a guy in there. I mean, we're in the middle of the Rugby World Cup at the moment, and there's a rugby player from France called Marc Sicilian, who was the French captain. He played 50-odd Test matches for his country. A big towering bloke who was very well known in the Bourgogne area of France, who just couldn't actually adapt to being retired. And you see a lot of stories of sportsmen who their identity is their sport and their success on the pitch. They get heralded and paid and all the rest of it. And when it finishes, they, instead of being referred to as Fred, who is the amazing footballer, they're referred to as Fred, the ex, or the former, or the person that used to be. And all of a sudden, their identity changes completely. And Marc Sicilian, that's not Fred, the actual, but he hasn't killed anybody. No, the real Fred, the Brazilian. Marc Sicilian just basically collapsed a little bit after he retired. He struggled to find a role in the world. He started drinking a lot, changed his character again, and ended up walking into an end-of-season party in France, where a number of rugby teams were celebrating the end of the season. Rugby players are quite well known for celebrating in big style.
Yes, this is true.
But Sicilian had been drinking all afternoon, walked in to collect his wife because he wanted her to go home with him. She said, "No, I'm enjoying myself, I'm staying here." He came back an hour later with a shotgun and basically put 3 bullets in her, and woke up with a horrendous hangover the next morning in a prison cell in France, screaming his wife's name, saying, "Where are you? Where are you? Come and get me." He hadn't realised that he'd done it.
Oh.
So, and his life in that moment changed dramatically, and I think you can have a little bit of sympathy for people like that who basically one moment of madness and all of a sudden their life is a completely different entity. But again, it was a horrible thing he did.
So far then, this is sounding quite depressing and dark. Are there any I don't know, can there be happier moments in the book which is about people murdering?
Well, what I've tried to do with everybody that's in there is not just concentrate on the crime they committed. They're all people who enjoyed sporting success. So there's a number of stories of success in sport in there as well. A number of quite funny stories about their lives and outside of the sporting environment. And then ultimately the fact that they fell from grace. But, the fact that they're in there is they rose in the first place. So there are stories of success and stories